I'm just getting working, hang on.
Okay, thank you guys for coming today. I'm Elaine Bystrom, and I'm the library director at the Kalama Library. And this is a joint venture here between Kalama History House and the library to have Joanna come and speak here today. And for those of you that don't know what Kalama History House is, Joanna has quite a collection of historical items from all, I don't know, way back.
Yeah, way back.
And we've got a little baby doll carriage here, and she's got some pictures over here. There is a sign on City Hall for Kalama History House, and there were some display cases. And no one is quite sure how much space is going to be allocated for Kalama History House in the renovated City Hall, but we're going to do our best to get as much of that stuff in there as possible. So anyway, there is a donation jar up here for anyone who wants to make donations to Kalama History House. All of it goes to Kalama History House. There's some photos that Joanna has brought, and there's also a little flyer. We're going to have another history talk on November 16th. Pete Paulson is going to be speaking about growing up in Kalama, and that will be from 2 to 4 p.m. in the City Council chambers on November 16th. So if you need a little reminder, pick up a flyer there by the donation jar. So I think most of you know Miss Joanna, so she doesn't really need any more introduction. So, and we will be taking a short break after about 25 minutes because we're recording this and the camera will time out. So we'll have to stop it and then we'll have a 1-minute intermission and start it up again. So, Miss Joanna.
Thank you. Before I start, I want you to know we've got some other good historians in this crowd. The Wilsons in the back row there, and my little brother here, who's older than me, and you thought nobody was. And then Brian Leroy in the back, and Roy Modrow over here. The mayor was going to be here, and I'm sure some of the rest of you too. I just can't remember or know all of you who have some history, but anybody who lives in Kalama has got some history. One of the coffees down here, coffees were a big deal in here. I just want to give you a couple of dates. I won't bore you with that. That's like going to school. But in 1869, Kalama had a post office. Kalama still has a post office. And just so you know, there was a post office at Pigeon Springs. A lot of you don't know what Pigeon Springs is, but I know Bill does, and my family, and probably the Wilsons know Pigeon Springs. And then Washington became a state in 1889. When that happened, my grandfather was grandfathered in to be a citizen of America. And in 1896, the cemetery opened. Now, if that isn't a history, you've got it from beginning to end. I don't know when Kalama was founded, but it was, Ezra Meeker was supposed to have been up the countryside, ended up in Puyallup, and there's a museum for him up there. The name Kalama and the Kalama thing downtown, whatever you call it. Anyway, John Kalama started on the Kalama River, and there was an Indian tribe around here that had a name similar to Kalama. Pete and I had that one time, but I don't know it right now. And anyway, so that's where the name Kalama came from, sort of gradually became that. And you know, if you're going to do this kind of stuff, you're supposed to tell a joke so everybody pay attention to you. Well, I don't know any jokes, but I do know my dad. And that can be kind of a joke if you wanted it to be. But he was the marshal for a few years, and it wasn't growing up, the child of the marshal wasn't a big thing. I got caught stealing flowers, and Bill got caught shooting out street lights. But other than that, I mean, I must have been pure. She wasn't, but she must have been. But I don't remember her getting in trouble. But anyway, Dad hardly ever gave us any stories about downtown, but there certainly were a few. And one of my favorites is he got a call out into China Garden, and that's where his call came from. It's about where the school is now. And they said that somebody ran over somebody up there. So Dad goes out there, and I don't remember the name, but he says, he's there, and he says, well, Charlie, why'd you run over her? He says, well, I told her to get out of the way, and she wouldn't do it. So that's Kalama for you. Okay, there are a lot of other stories about Kalama, and my brother is here, and there are a few stories about him and Don Moores that some of you would appreciate a lot. Don Moores, for those of you who don't know, is Richard and Mike's dad, and he was a first-class character here in Kalama, did a lot of crazy things, but Bill was in on part of those. Okay, I'll start with some of the things that, what brought people to Kalama. This was the bad time in Kansas with the Dust Bowl and all that sort of thing, and so a lot of people who moved to Kalama came from Kansas, and including my grandmother, who came in the late 1880s. I'm not just sure of the date. And she came by wagon. Most people did because they were poor. And one of the only advantage to that was that if you had cream and you needed butter, you put that in a crock and put it on the back of the wagon. So by the time you got wherever you were going, you had butter. You didn't have to churn it. And I still have the crock that was my grandmother's. So, but there was the lumber and fishing, and the big lumber thing was the Mountain Timber Company. Now, down at the port, they have this new mall that's called the Mountain Timber Mall, and that's where that came from. Mountain Timber Company did a lot of logging around here, and they were responsible for bringing in the Chinese, and we had some Chinese buried in our cemetery. You know I take care of the cemetery, so you always have to listen to cemetery stories. So, anyway, I think that's where we got China Garden, because they must have lived out in there. And my mom said that they worked for the Mountain Timber Company building railroads to bring the lumber in. And Marguerite Johnson Hahn, told me some about the Mountain Timber Company and some of the logging that was in her part of town. And she was from Green Mountain, so I'm not just sure where all they went, but nearly everywhere apparently. They were also responsible for the Spencer Creek Road that the Madros used to get their logs in, and their logs, they logged off. You've been out to the Madro area, Madro Bridge, which was not even a dream back that far. They brought their logs in through the Spencer Creek Road, and their logs were cut and used to power the ships that took the logs from Kalama to California. And on the way back, those ships had to have ballast. So after the earthquake in San Francisco, the ballast that came with the ships was the rubble off the streets of San Francisco. And that rubble is in First Street. And your First Street is a street that runs beside the shopping center. And when I was young, that was pretty much the main street. The doctor was there, the newspaper was there, the phone company was there. There was a big saloon there. There were lots of saloons every place. And the saloon was before me. My mom sort of remembered it. But anyway, that's part of, let's see. The Doty Fish Company was eventually sold to the New England Fish Company, and that operated for a long time. The connection with the Doty Fish Company was built by a guy named Ruckles. And Mr. Ruckles built what the new people in town called the mansion. And if you don't know, us older ones remember it as Mrs. McKinley's house. And Mrs. McKenzie was one of my patients when Terry and her brothers and sisters were little and going with me to visit the sick people in town. And and when they had her funeral, they had it in the house where she lived. And I said to Mom, how can they do that, you know, because she knew everybody. Well, by the time you get in your 90s, like Bill and me, there's not a big crowd anymore. you outlived them. So we had plenty of room for everybody in Mrs. McKenzie's house. The other big event, besides the fishing and the lumber, was the strawberry fields. There were huge strawberry fields out in Cloverdale, and there was also a mink farm. So if your horse died, you didn't have any place to do it. You took it to the mink farm, and they made use of it. So that was operated by Hendrickson's. And not Ed Hendrickson, but Bill Hendrickson. And we just buried his son the other day. So anyway, the Strawberry Festival was a huge event every year, and they served as many as 4,000 pieces of cake with strawberries on them. And the strawberries were put on these cakes one at a time. And we didn't have the Amalak, but we had lots of lodges, and that's what the lodge ladies did, including my mom. We have pictures of them doing that. And then this whole thing was covered with whipped cream. So we didn't have mixers and things like that, and you can't imagine stirring whipped cream with one of those 4,000 people. But we did have agitator washing machines. So that's how they made the whipped cream. Which makes sense, doesn't it? Moving on, there's a picture. I don't have a picture of the time we did the 125. We served, our cake was pretty good size, but not nearly that big. And they worried because how are we going to build this cake and keep it in the freezer and do all that? Well, Otto Engelman built that cake for 4,000 people, and we didn't have such a thing as a freezer. But we managed to get it done, and people managed to get to there and eat cake, people from every place. So things have progressed, and we're sometimes a little fussier than we need to be, I think. The town is at 2 feet above sea level. But when it started, it was up on stilts, and there are a couple pictures over here of the town on stilts. And when I was mayor, I went through the ordinances. I thought I might find something in here that's fun. Well, I found something that's fun. There's an ordinance that says you cannot tie your cow downtown. And there's a picture here of a cow tied downtown. When we were young, it was Ben Jett's cows were downtown in a truck, making noise all night, while Mrs. Jett walked home up above where Carolyn Coffey lives now. Carolyn Reynoldsson, you don't know Coffey. Anyway, and the town up on stilts. Now the channel for the river was on the other side of the island. So and this is what I presume somewhat, but they moved the channel from the other side of the island to the Kalama side of the island. And in doing that, you know, there's a lot of silt. So when the tide came in, the silt was washed into the town, and that's how the streets were filled, except for First Street that had San Francisco in it. But, another one of Carolyn's relatives, Tommy Woolsey, worked on that dredge, my mom told me. So we're still around, a lot of us oldies. So, and eventually this was filled, and we have lots of pictures of downtown. There was a dry goods store when I was little. Of course, by the time that it was around, it was button shoe age dry goods store. And it sold out when I was in grade school, if you can imagine, sold out, but you could buy some button shoes for 10 or 15 cents, I don't know, but my feet were too big. I didn't get a pair, but a lot of us kids did, and it was really a treat. And she, Mrs. What was her name? Anyway, Bill will remember. Anyway, she would go to the store every day, and it hadn't been open not really open in years and years. We do have a picture of that. We also have a picture of the building that my mom always called the KP Hall, and that was because it was owned and operated by the Knights of Pythias. And that building had been the Opera House and later the theater when we were young. It was a theater. Cost a dime to get into the movies, unless you knew the back door, and then you could go around the back door. And one of the treats was one of the ladies in town, and you don't need to know her name, but you probably wouldn't anyway, but she used to nurse her baby in the lobby. And there was a parade of kids go in the toilet, so we could watch her nurse her baby. So, anyway, this the asphalt for the high school, the heavy equipment that they built the town with and that they built the roads with was a pick and shovel and probably a homemade wooden wheelbarrow, which probably weighed a ton in the first place. We have some pictures of the cut through from the top of the hill up to the school, but none of the others. There is a picture here of the main hill, and that was an event too. Carolyn tells me that, no, Sheila told me this one, that her dad, who worked for the WPA, and Mr. Kramer, who lived at the top of the hill, the house is still there, had a big meeting to try to figure out how you could put asphalt on that and not have it all slide to the bottom of the hill. So, you know, we do those things and not even think about them, but they had to learn from someplace. A lot of people in that other grade age group would remember that hill because it snowed hard one year when I was in about 8th or 9th grade, I don't remember for sure. And the main road through town was the main highway. My dad was the policeman at the time. So he put a barrier on each side of the schoolhouse hill. And then you could take your sled to the top of the hill and go all the way to the river. And then if you were there at the right time, you could hook your sled onto the back of Dad's World War II Jeep and be pulled up the hill so he could do it again. So he had a great time with the kids. The process of putting the silt into town, maybe I told you this, but Carolyn's relative, Tommy Woolsey, worked on that dredge that helped bring that silt into town. I think during the Second World War is kind of an interesting time. Of course, I was a kid when I was in 7th grade when the war started, and by the time I was a sophomore, it was over. So our entertainment for those times was we had scrap drives. We'd get a truck and somebody would drive us and we'd go around town and pick up all the metal and stuff. And we took it, I don't remember where, but the guy's name, according to my dad, was Scrap Iron. So whatever that was, you don't know. But if you knew my dad or you know my brother, you could figure it out. So anyway, we did that. And if we happened to get a bathtub, wow, because they weighed a lot, and then you were the winner for the day. So that was one of the things. The other thing, we had rationing. And
down the bottoms.
Huh?
In the what we call the bottoms.
What did she say?
That's where you took the scrap.
Where?
Was
Down in the bottoms.
Oh, down in the bottoms, which is now where the mills are. Yeah, there were houses down there too, a whole row of houses. And another thing that will probably space some of you out, but there was a row of houses down there, and they had toilets, but they were not like kind of toilets we have today, but they were outhouses, and they were on the back of the porch, and you could have a little privacy there, and the stuff went down, And when the tide came in, it went out. So, see, everybody's grossed out by that. But then the main sewer went down the hill and went into the Columbia River around where Haslam's lived. And that was about on the bottom of First Street. And the boys and Catherine Coffey, Carolyn's older sister, she was one of the party girls, but they went down there to take a dive off of that house and swim. And now everybody'd be grossed out to think that sewer happened down there. But Bill's at 96, 96, so, and Catherine lived a long time too, so I guess it didn't hurt him. Anyway, and then we had, of course we had rationing, and there were certain things we didn't have. We didn't have a lot of sugar. Cigarettes were rare. And we had stamps, and you had to trade red stamps if you're going to get meat, and I think the others were blue or green, something like that, for other kinds of things that you got in the store. Bill worked in a grocery store downtown, and it was his job to bring the right stamps back, and everybody called them points. And one of my dad's stories, and he had a million of them, but anyway, Steve, who owned the store, thought Bill was made of spun glass, I think, or something like that. But anyway, Dad went down there and he says, Steve, Bill got hurt today. Well, of course, he's got this 15-year-old kid driving a truck delivering groceries, and he's all frantic. And so he says, well, what happened? He said, well, he had all those points in his pocket, and he stepped off the running board and fell, and all those points just poked him in the butt. So, yeah, my dad was a great storyteller, and my mother was a historian, and I don't know where Bill and I got it. I'm not so sure. Anyway, and then what would have killed me, except I didn't know any better, and nobody had any money, we only got 3 pairs of shoes a year. And no chewing gum. We got some chewing gum from Mexico. We got ice cream once in a while, but when they had enough sugar. Candy was not real handy because of the sugar was rationed. I can't think of any other thing that affected everybody, but a lot of it did. We went from the Depression, where we didn't have much of anything, to the war, where things were rationed. And, kids will accept anything. Whatever happens, it's okay. It's life. And so, and I was a kid. So it was okay with me. And being at war was the same way, because from the time I can remember, through the Korean War, and then Vietnam and so on, there's always been war, but I didn't know any better. And I knew that if America got in the war, that we'd win and it'd be over. That was simple. It wasn't quite that simple what had happened, but that's what I knew as a kid. Just get America over there and everything will be all right. So, anyway, so that was
The gas.
Bill was able to drive the delivery truck. Those were pretty good days. You called up and told the store what you wanted, and then they loaded in the truck. Bill drove for Steve, and John Hoggett drove for his family. And so you just told them, and then they came and brought the groceries to you, which was pretty cool. Now you can do that, but I think you have to make a payment. That was normal practice in our day. And Bill was pretty young, but we had an old truck, and somebody had to drive the truck to put the hay on in order to get it to the barn. So he learned to drive early, and the truck. And he tells me that at 9 years old, he was behind a horse turning hay. So kids learn to work early, and my dad was from a big family, so his kids were taught what he was taught. But the girls had it pretty easy. My mom started milking cows, and she said, my girls aren't going to ever milk cows, and we didn't ever have to. We did other things, but we didn't have to milk cows. And when I was mayor, they had a cow milking contest. I couldn't even figure out what to do. I knew where, but I didn't know how. So, one of the other big things in Kalama, and if you've been down to the port and seen it, it was the ferry. Now, the ferry brought the trains to Prescott. If you don't know Prescott, it's across the river, and it's just a little bit north of Rainier. So the trains came from Portland to Prescott, and there was no way to turn it around. So they loaded it on the ferry, and then they brought the ferry to Kalama, and then they unloaded them onto the tracks, and then the trains went back to Portland. So my grandfather had a grunt job on that ferry, but the neighbors, one of the neighbors who's been long gone, was one of the captains, and the lady who started the Cowles County Museum and Historical Society, of course she was from Kalama. She was the Gores, and we have the Gores buried in our cemetery, and Mrs. Umbaugh, who was the starter of that project. And my mom, of course, was a founder, and her daughters were early members, so I've been a member of the Cowles County Historical Society since the early 50s. So I'm probably 52 or 3, something like that, a long time. So anyway, and Mrs. Umbaugh was a school teacher, and one of her other projects was to be the referee in a football game. Probably in a long dress or something, because it was a long time ago. Speaking of sports, you know, Kalama is sports, and Brian will probably tell you a little bit more about that when he gets to it. But we had a Kalama baseball team, and Bill helped with what they called the bat boy in those days. And he was, I don't know, 9 or 10, something like that. I don't remember, but we have pictures of him when he was doing that. And I think there was a Leroy on that team. And then Mrs. Harner, that was a drugstore. And when we were little, they had one of those great big scales, and you could run in there and get weighed. Or you could go in there and telephone your grandma. And I went in there one time, and I said, I want to call my grandma. And Mr. Harnett said, well, who's your grandma? And I said, well, she's my grandma. So just a minute.
We're going to have to pause here for a second.